On a quiet night in 1987, Jan-Michael Vincent stepped into the studio's forgotten archive room, dust swirling under a single flickering bulb. On the back shelf sat a film canister with no label, only a date smeared in fading ink. He lifted it carefully. No one on the lot remembered storing it, and the last archivist, who worked that room, had vanished from the payroll 15 years earlier. The archive room was one of the oldest spaces on the lot, built long before digital catalogs, long before automated storage, long before anyone cared about temperature control or proper ventilation. Dust gathered in the corners like permanent residents. Metal shelves stretched along the walls, stacked with reels no one had touched in decades. Most people avoided the place unless they needed something for a legal check or a restoration project. Jan wasn't supposed to be there that night. He had wandered in only because the hallway lights flickered, revealing the slightly ajar door at the end. Something about the sliver of dim light spilling out into the corridor pulled him closer, as if the room itself had exhaled after years of silence. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing softly across the concrete floor. Cold air pressed in, not the artificial chill of air conditioning, more like the natural cold that settles over forgotten spaces. His eyes adjusted slowly, following the thin path of illumination cast by the lone bulb overhead. That's when he saw it. High on the back shelf, half hidden behind a stack of old episode reels, was the unmarked film canister. Most cans had thick typed labels, production codes, director initials, reel numbers. This one was different. No markings except for a date scrawled hurriedly in pen, €12.872. The numbering was strange. No reel code, no show title, nothing to anchor it to a production. Jan reached up and pulled it down carefully. Dust shook loose in a faint cloud. The metal was cold to the touch, heavier than expected, like something inside shifted with intention. Behind him, someone cleared their throat. He turned sharply. A man stood in the doorway, holding a small clipboard under his arm. He was tall, thin, maybe late 50s, wearing an old archivist sweater the studio had phased out years ago. His hair was grey, neatly combed, expression calm. "You're not supposed to move those," the man said softly. Jan blinked. "Sorry, I didn't know anyone was working down here." The man stepped forward, inspecting the shelves with quiet familiarity. "Most people forget this room exists. Easier that way." Jan glanced at the canister in his hands. "Do you know what this is?" "It doesn't match anything in the catalogue." The man's eyes drifted to the faded date. Something in his face tightened, almost imperceptibly. "That shouldn't be here anymore," he said. "Why?" But instead of answering, the man gently reached for the canister. For a moment, Jan considered giving it to him, but curiosity outweighed caution. "Wait," Jan said. "Who logged this in? Was it before your time?" The man lowered his hand. "Before everyone's time," he murmured. "Some things stopped belonging to the studio long before they stopped being stored here." Jan's brow furrowed. "I didn't catch your name." The man paused. His grip tightened on the clipboard, just slightly. "People used to call me Martin," he said. "Martin Hale." The name hit Jan with a faint echo. He had seen it somewhere, a payroll sheet, an old memo, maybe a retirement notice. But the details hovered just out of reach. "You worked here a long time?" Jan asked. Martin gave a faint nod. 15 years, down in this room, day and night, until they didn't need archivists anymore. Jan studied him, his sweater, his clipboard, his calm demeanor. He looked like someone who belonged in the room, someone who lived between reels and dust. But something felt off. "Martin," Jan said slowly, "when did you retire?" Martin's gaze drifted toward the shelves, the bulb flickering overhead. "I never had the chance to," he replied. The words hung in the air, quiet, matter of fact, unsettling. Before Jan could speak again, Martin turned, walked toward the back wall, and vanished down the narrow aisle between shelves. Jan followed, just a few steps behind. But the aisle was empty, silent, still, no movement, no footsteps, no sign of anyone leaving. Just rows of film cans staring back at him, untouched for decades. And in his hands, the unmarked canister suddenly felt much heavier. Jan stood frozen for a long moment, The dim hum of the overhead bulb, the only sound in the archive room. The narrow aisle where Martin had disappeared was barely wide enough for a single person, and it led straight to a concrete wall. No side doors, no vents, nowhere to step out. Yet the man was gone, as cleanly as if he'd never been there. Jan exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He wasn't rattled easily, but something about Martin's calm tone, his clipped phrasing, the way he simply slipped out of the room, it lingered unnervingly. He turned his attention back to the canister. The faded date stared up at him, 12/08/72. The handwriting had the uneven, hurried slant of someone who didn't intend for the label to last. Jan brushed away more dust, revealing the slightest indentation beneath the ink, almost like another label had once been peeled off. Why hide a reel this deep in the stacks? He set the canister on the central table and found an old splicer lamp nearby. It flickered to life, casting a warm amber glow over the metal. Slowly, Jan loosened the lid. The seal broke with a soft metallic sigh. Inside was a tightly wound 16mm reel. But the film wasn't studio stock. The edges were slightly warped. The leader tape was hand-spliced, and faint pencil markings ran along the first few inches of celluloid. Jan leaned closer, trying to make out the writing. The numbers appeared to be timestamps, irregular, uneven, scribbled by someone working quickly, possibly nervously. He threaded the first few inches through his fingers. The first frame was dark, almost entirely black. The next frame showed a sliver of light like a hallway corner. The third frame revealed part of a face, just an eye, a hand, something close to the lens. This wasn't production footage. This was personal, unlisted, uncontrolled. A soft voice came from behind him. "Are you sure you want to look at that?" Jan turned sharply again, expecting Martin. Instead, a young archival assistant stood in the doorway, holding a clipboard. She couldn't have been older than 25. Her studio badge caught the flickering light. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," she said. "I heard someone was down here. We don't get visitors often." Jan exhaled, steadying his heartbeat. "Did you see someone else come through here? An older man, grey hair, archivist sweater." She blinked. "No one's been down here but you. I've been at the desk the last hour. The logs show no entries." Jan hesitated. "Do you know a man named Martin Hale?" The assistant squinted slightly. "The name's on one of the memorial plaques near the main gate. He died in work accident, I think." Jan felt the chill settle deeper. 1972, he repeated slowly. She nodded. "Same year they cleared part of this archive, after the fire. That whole section got sealed off for months." Her eyes drifted to the open canister on the table. "Is that from the damaged inventory?" she asked. "It wasn't logged." Jan replied. "That's impossible," she said. "Everything from that period was catalogued during the restoration." Jan lifted the reel gently. "Not the..." The assistant stepped closer, studying the handwritten date. "December 8th, she murmured. "That's the day, Martin." But she stopped herself, pressing her lips tightly together, as if stepping too close to a story she had only heard in fragments. Jan closed the canister. "Has anyone ever mentioned him still being seen here? Over the years?" The assistant gave a strained smile. "You'd be surprised what old buildings do at night. Shadows look like people. An air vent bangs and someone thinks they heard a voice. Half the crew has a ghost story." "I don't think this was a ghost story," Jan said quietly. She glanced at the canister again. "Whatever's on that reel, just be careful. Some things were sealed away for a reason." Before Jan could respond, she stepped back into the hall, offering him a polite nod before disappearing around the corner. The room fell silent again. Jan looked toward the aisle where Martin had vanished. The air there felt heavier somehow, like the lingering warmth of someone who had stood there moments before. He turned off the splicer lamp, closed the canister and tucked it under his arm. Whatever this reel was, whoever Martin Hale truly was, Jan knew one thing. The archive room hadn't been waiting for someone to find the film. It had been waiting for someone who would understand why it was left behind. Jan carried the canister out of the archive room, with the careful grip of someone holding something fragile, not just in weight, but in meaning. The hallway outside felt warmer, brighter, almost too loud compared to the still heavy air inside. He paused beneath the flickering corridor light, letting his eyes adjust, letting his thoughts settle. He replayed the moment in his mind. Martin's calm voice, the quiet authority he carried, the way he moved like someone who had spent years cataloging shelves in the dark. And then, that impossible disappearance down a dead-end aisle. The younger assistant's words clung to him. He died in 72, the same year written on the canister. Jan made his way towards stage 2, where an old projection booth still remained from the studio's early days. Most people use digital monitors now. The booth was mostly a curiosity, a relic for interns to explore, but it still worked, and it was private. Inside, the small room smelled faintly of dust and metal. A lonely projector sat on a table, its enamel chipped, its gears restless and eager under Jan's hand. He placed the canister beside it, hesitated, then finally opened it again. He examined the edges of the film more closely this time. The leader tape had been repaired multiple times with different types of splicing tape, some yellowed, some newer, indicating someone had handled it long after it was first recorded. Jan threaded the film through the gate, turning the crank slowly. Frame by frame slid past the light, dark hallway. Glare from a hanging lamp, a hand covering part of the lens, a shadow moving toward the camera. The footage wasn't steady. Whoever shot it seemed to move quickly, nervous. A whisper of audio clung to the edge of the frames, just enough to hint at breaths, footsteps, doors opening. Then a sudden pause. Jan leaned closer. The frame showed a door, a metal one, identical to the old fire door near the back of the studio that had been replaced years ago. The handle was bent slightly, just like in the stories crews used to tell about the accident in 72. As Jan scrutinized the door in the frame, the booth's window reflected movement behind him, a subtle shift, a shape. He turned. A man stood just inside the doorway of the booth. Not Martin, someone younger, maybe mid-30s, dressed in a vintage crew jacket, the kind the studio stopped issuing decades ago. A lanyard hung around his neck, the plastic ID holder cracked and faded. "Sorry," the man said quietly. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Jan's heartbeat slowed, but not entirely. "You need something." The man nodded toward the projector. "I heard you were looking at old reels. Thought I should tell you that booth isn't used much for a reason." "What reason?" The man stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. His expression wasn't threatening, just weighted, as if he carried information that didn't sit comfortably. "Back in 72, he began. They shot some test material for a pilot. Nothing big, but something happened in one of the back corridors. Someone got hurt. Some say it was an accident with equipment. Others say someone was down there who shouldn't have been." "And the archivist?" Jan asked softly. The man hesitated. Martin Hale was the only one on the logs that night. But when security pulled the tapes, the hallway cameras went dark for 12 minutes, completely blank. 12 minutes, Jan repeated. He thought of the timestamps on the film, uneven, frantic. The man pointed to the reel. That footage was never supposed to stay on the log. It was tagged for disposal, but someone kept it, hid it. "Martin?" Jan asked. The man shrugged slowly. "Maybe, or maybe someone wanted him blamed." He stepped back toward the door. "Just be careful what you watch. Not every reel shows what really happened. Some show what someone wanted you to see." Before Jan could ask anything else, the man slipped out, footsteps fading quickly, as if he didn't want to be followed. Alone again, Jan turned back to the projector. The reel sat in the gate, silent, waiting. He exhaled. Whatever truth was on this film, whatever story had been buried in 1972, he was now deep enough that turning back felt impossible. He rested his hand on the switch, the bulb humming quietly beneath it. The past wasn't reaching out to him. He was reaching into it. The projector's motor rumbled to life with a low, nostalgic vibration, one of those sounds only older studios knew how to make. The bulb warmed, blooming into a steady white beam. Dust threads shimmered in its path like tiny ghosts, rising into the air. Jan steeled himself and let the first seconds of the footage roll. The image jumped, stabilized, then revealed a narrow studio hallway lit by a single overhead fixture. The camera operator's breathing was audible, shallow, urgent, Their footsteps echoed against the concrete. The frame swung toward a metal door at the end of the hall, the same bent-handled fire door Jan remembered from stage 4 stories. A hand reached out, trembling slightly, and pushed the door open. Inside was darkness. Only a small circular window let in the dull glow of a distant lamp. The film flickered. Something moved in that darkness, quickly, too fast for Jan to identify. Then the audio wavered, as if the microphone had been brushed by a sleeve. A whisper surfaced. Not a voice, not words, just the faint sound of someone clearing their throat. Jan leaned forward, his stomach tightened. It was the same sound Martin made in the archive room before speaking. The next frames were disjointed, blurs of light and movement. A tilted floor, the edge of a wall. Then a clearer shot, a man's silhouette entering the frame. He stood half-turned, as if he didn't want to be recognized by the lens. The shape was familiar, too familiar. Jan froze. The silhouette looked like Martin, same narrow shoulders, same tidy posture. But the frame was dated. Before Jan could process it, the projector hiccuped, and the footage cut to black. The reel spun for a few seconds before catching the next strip of image. Now the camera lay sideways as if dropped. All Jan could see was the lower third of the corridor, shoes, the edge of a mop bucket, scattered papers. Someone stepped into view. A pair of polished shoes, then a hand picking up something off the floor. A film canister, the same one sitting beside Jan right now. The reel clicked as the film ran out. The projector hummed on, projecting an empty beam. Jan sat back slowly, pulse steady but deep. He rewound the reel halfway and examined a few frames more carefully. The silhouette was sharper than he remembered. The frame where the man turned his head just slightly, revealing the line of a jaw, the edge of his nose. It wasn't a perfect match, but it was close enough that the similarity was impossible to ignore. And yet, the archivist assistant insisted Martin Hale died on December 8th, the same date written on the reel, the same date someone had captured this footage. Jan's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the projection booth door. He turned. The young assistant from earlier stood there, clutching her clipboard more tightly than before. "Sorry to bother you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "But do you still have that reel?" Jan slowly nodded. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I thought about what you asked earlier," she said. "About Martin. I checked the internal personnel note. I wasn't supposed to, but..." She swallowed. "There are two things you should know." Jan waited. "First," she continued, "Martin Hale didn't die in a work accident. At least not officially. The report says he left the lot at midnight and never returned home. The coroner filed a missing person case, but the studio closed it quietly." "And the second?" Jan asked. The assistant's voice grew even softer. "He wasn't supposed to be working that night. His shift ended at 6. No one knows why he stayed." Jan's breath steadied, or what he was documenting. She looked at the projector, then at the reel. Whatever's on that film, it wasn't meant for anyone on the lot to see. It might not even be a record of what happened. It might be a version of it. Jan finished. "Someone's version." The assistant nodded. "And Jan," she added carefully, "there's something else. The canister you found. A similar one was logged missing from evidence storage in night. The log says it was last handled by someone with initials MH. Jan exhaled slowly. Martin Hale, the man who supposedly vanished. The man Jan had just spoken to. Or someone who looked exactly like him. The assistant stepped back toward the door. "If you want to keep looking," she said, "just don't do it alone." And then she left, leaving Jan in the half-lit booth, with a reel that seemed to contain a history the studio had chosen to rewrite. Jan rested his hand on the canister once more. Whatever this was, he was now in the middle of it. Jan didn't move for nearly a full minute after the assistant left. The projection booth felt smaller now, as if the walls understood too much of the conversation that had just taken place. The old projector continued to hum in the background, its warm bulb casting a soft, dusty glow over the reel sitting on the table. He rewound the film again, slowly this time, listening to the soft clatter of sprockets catching each perforation. There was a rhythm to it, steady and mechanical, a comforting counterpoint to the uneasy stillness settling in his chest. When the reel reached its starting point, the projector clicked and fell silent. The quiet that followed felt different than before, not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of anticipation, as if the booth was waiting for what Jan would do next. He lifted the canister, weighing it in his hand. The cool metal felt heavier than its size suggested, as though it carried something more than a strip of film. He thought about Martin's expression when he saw the date on the canister, a tightening, not fear, not shock, but recognition. Jan closed the canister and stepped out of the booth. The hallway was empty, the linoleum reflecting the faint overhead light. Somewhere farther down, a door thudded closed. The sound echoed, stretched thin by distance. Jan walked slowly towards stage 4, the oldest building still in use. The bent-handled door from the footage had been replaced in the 80s, but the outline of the old hinge still marked the frame. He ran his fingers along the faint indentation. There was no plaque, no trace of an incident, just a stretch of hallway with a slightly different echo than the rest, as if it remembered something the studio had forgotten. "Mr. Vincent?" Jan turned. A security officer, older, graying, the type who knew the lot better than most department heads, approached with a cautious step. "Did one of the assistants tell you I was looking for you?" Jan asked. "No," the officer replied, "but whenever someone wanders into the old wings, I make sure they're not lost or looking for trouble." Jan offered a polite smile, just following a thread. The guard's eyes drifted to the canister under Jan's arm. "That from the archive room?" "Yes." The guard exhaled through his nose, slowly. "I knew Martin," he said. "Back in the day." Jan's interest sharpened. "You worked with him?" "For a few months," the guard replied. "Before the situation." Jan waited. The guard rubbed the back of his neck. He was meticulous, quiet. Came early, left late, but the last few weeks before he disappeared. He looked over his shoulder a lot. "Told me someone was checking the logs for his archive room entries. Said reels were being moved around without signatures. Studio politics?" Jan guessed. "More like studio secrets," the guard murmured. He nodded toward the canister. "Whatever you have there, Martin asked me once what would happen if footage went missing from evidence storage." "What did you say?" "I said anything that wasn't logged didn't exist." Jan felt a cold clarity creep in. So someone made sure it didn't exist. The guard nodded once. Or tried to. Jan glanced back at the door frame, the indentation of the old hinge catching the low light. "What happened in 1972? Jan asked. The guard hesitated, not unsure but reluctant. "There was a blackout," he said finally. "Only 12 minutes, but those were the only 12 minutes not recorded on the security tapes for the entire year." 12 minutes, Jan repeated. "After that," the guard continued, "a man was injured. Some say it was equipment failure. Others say someone followed him into the hallway and things got out of hand. When lights came back on, only Martin was there." "And the injured man?" Jan asked. "He survived," the guard said. "But he refused to talk about it. Left the studio a month later. Nobody saw him again." Jan tightened his grip on the canister. The reel inside shifted slightly, almost as if acknowledging the guard's story. "Martin," Jan began carefully. "Did he ever come back to the lot after that night?" The guard looked down the hallway, eyes softening. "People said they saw him. Rarely. Always in the old corridors. Always at night. But officially," he shook his head, "he never came back through the front gate." Jan swallowed. "But you believe the stories?" The guard met Jan's gaze. "I believe some people finish what they started, even if no one sees them do it." He stepped back, tipping his cap slightly. "Be careful, Mr. Vincent. The past doesn't like being replayed." When the guard left, Jan stood alone in the dim corridor, the canister cool against his arm. The reel wasn't just a film. It was a message, a leftover thread, something unresolved that someone, maybe Martin, wanted someone else to find. Jan looked down the empty hallway, feeling the same faint pull he'd felt in the archive room. Whatever had happened in 1972 was still echoing here, and now he had stepped directly into its path. Jan walked deeper into the old corridor, the canister tucked firmly under his arm. The hallway lights buzzed faintly, their glow uneven, giving the shadows a slow, pulsing rhythm. The farther he moved from the active stages, the more the air shifted, cooler, quieter, as if he was stepping backward through time, rather than across a studio lot. A faint smell of old film stock lingered in this part of the building. Not chemicals, not dust, but film, that warm, slightly sweet scent of acetate aging in the dark. He reached the service stairwell, narrow, cold, and poorly lit. A sign, yellowed with age, hung crooked on the wall. Authorized personnel only. He pushed the door open. The stairwell echoed as he descended, each step sounding older than the last. Halfway down, he stopped. A faint beam of light spilled from the crack under the door to the sub-basement hallway, a place so rarely used that even security barely remembered it existed. Jan pushed the door open slowly. The hallway beyond felt untouched since the early 70s. Old exit maps, outdated fire extinguishers, a peeling bulletin board displaying notices from shows long cancelled, and at the far end, barely visible, was the bent-handled fire door, the same one from the reel, unchanged except for the years etched into its surface. Jan approached it cautiously. Up close, the handle looked exactly like it did in the footage, warped, dented and scratched. The metal had been sanded once, maybe twice, but the original damage still showed through. He pressed his fingers against the bent metal. It was cold, deeply cold, like it hadn't been touched in years. But there were fresh scuff marks on the floor. Someone had been here. Recently. Jan's breath tightened slightly. He looked to the side of the door and noticed something taped to the wall. A narrow strip of paper curled at the edges from age. The handwriting was small, careful. Do not restore. Leave as is. No initials, no date. But the handwriting, it matched the timestamp markings on the reel. Jan pocketed the strip of paper and turned to open the fire door. The hinges groaned softly, tired, heavy, resisting movement. Inside was a small, dark utility room. Dust coated every surface in a thin, undisturbed layer. Almost every surface. Near the back of the room, barely visible in the dim light, something glinted. Jan stepped carefully toward it. A single metal object rested on an old wooden crate, a key ring with only one key. The tag was cracked, but the engraving was still clear. MH, Jan swallowed. His fingers hovered above the key, not touching, just feeling the weight of its presence. Behind him, a soft voice spoke. You found it. Jan spun around. Standing in the doorway was the same young archival assistant. Her face was slightly pale, her eyes focused not on him but on the key in front of him. You followed me? Jan asked. She shook her head. No, I've been looking for that room for weeks. You're the first person I've seen open that door. Jan studied her expression. Calm, concern, something else, something like recognition. Do you know what this key opens? He asked. She stepped inside slowly, her footsteps barely disturbing the dust. No, she said softly, but I know why it was left here. Jan waited. It's a marker, she said, a reminder of something unfinished. Jan tilted his head slightly. You said the studio tried to close the case, to bury everything. She nodded. They did, but some people leave pieces behind to make sure the story doesn't disappear entirely. Jan held her gaze for a moment. Do you think Martin Hale left this here? The assistant hesitated, long enough to reveal uncertainty, or maybe something deeper. I think, she finally said, that he wanted someone to understand what happened. Someone who would pay attention. Someone who wouldn't dismiss. Jan lifted the key ring. It felt cold, as if it had been waiting for years in that exact spot. What would he want me to do next? Jan asked. The assistant exhaled slowly, her eyes dropping to the floor. "Look for the door it belongs to," she said, because not everything that was sealed stayed sealed. The room fell silent. Only the hum of distant generators filtered through the walls. Jan slipped the key into his jacket pocket. The metal made the faintest clink against the canister he carried, two artifacts from a story that refused to stay buried. When he stepped back into the hallway, he felt it again, that subtle pull of the past, like unseen threads drawing him deeper into a narrative someone had begun writing decades before. And he realized something unsettlingly simple. Martin might not have vanished. He might have been guiding him all along. Jan climbed back up the narrow service stairwell, with the metal key in his pocket, the weight of it tapping lightly against the film canister at each step. The two objects felt connected now. One a visual record of something the studio never wanted preserved. The other a physical remnant left by someone who refused to be erased. At the top of the stairs he paused, listening. The hallway above sounded normal. Distant footsteps, a rolling cart, the soft thump of a door closing somewhere near stage 3. The ordinary noise of a working studio, yet Jan heard something deeper beneath it. A faint irregularity, like the building exhaled differently in this wing. He stepped into the corridor. The young archival assistant was already gone. Her absence left the hallway strangely empty, as if she had slipped back into the shadows of the building just as easily as Martin had. Jan walked slowly, scanning the numbered doors along the wall. Most were utility closets, old editing rooms, storage spaces repurposed half a dozen times over the decades. But every few feet he tested a handle quietly, discreetly. Some opened easily, others were sealed with new digital locks. And then he reached a door that didn't match the rest. Room B1009. The numbering was hand-painted, the paint cracked and uneven. The doorknob was older than the others, original brass, not replaced by modern hardware. A faint rectangular discoloration marked where a sign had been removed decades earlier. Jan pressed lightly on the handle. He tried again, applying a little more pressure. Still locked, he stepped back, glancing up and down the hallway before pulling the key from his pocket. The metal was old, its teeth worn. It didn't look like it belonged in a modern lock, but it looked exactly like it belonged in this one. Jan slid the key into the knob. It fit, not loosely, not tightly, perfectly. He turned it. A soft click answered, a sound so familiar, so smooth, it felt as if the lock had been waiting for that exact motion. Jan pushed the door open. The room was dark, air stale with disuse. He flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. He waited a moment, letting his eyes adapt. Pale light from the hallway seeped across the floor, revealing long shadows and shapes. Shelves, stacks of boxes, coiled cables hanging on hooks. A small desk covered in thin dust, and in the center of the room, facing the far wall, sat an old Steenbeck editing machine. Jan felt a chill, not of fear, but recognition. These machines were used to cut film before digital systems replaced them. This one looked exactly like the model from the early 70s. Most had been discarded or sold as scrap. He approached it slowly. The surface of the machine was covered in dust, except for two clear hand-shaped patches, where someone had rested their palms recently. Next to the Steenbeck lay a real spindle, empty but clean, and beside it an old clipboard. Jan lifted it carefully. The top sheet was yellowed, brittle. The next morning, the lot looked ordinary on the surface. Sunlight slanting across trailers, distant forklifts humming, crew members carrying coffee as they hurried between stages. But for Jan, the studio no longer felt like a place of work. It felt like a map, a coded landscape filled with small, deliberate signs, left behind by someone who refused to let their story die. He held the key in his hand as he crossed the service yard. The tag clinked softly with each step, the engraved letters MH catching glints of light. It didn't match any modern lock. Too old, too narrow, the grooves cut deeper than contemporary keys. It belonged to an era of doors the studio no longer used, or so everyone believed. Jan headed toward the administrative wing, the oldest building on the lot, older even than stage 1. Behind it was a narrow alleyway, barely wide enough for a utility cart. It was rarely accessed unless something burst or leaked. But Jan remembered something the guard had said. Some people finish what they started, even if no one sees them do it. If Martin left pieces behind, he would have hidden them in places no one bothered to look. Jan followed the alley until he reached a small metal door wedged between two ventilation units. It was painted over so many times the hinges were barely visible. The handle was stiff, frozen in place. Jan tested the key. It didn't fit. He continued deeper into the alley, stepping over coils of old cables and piles of forgotten equipment. The air smelled like dust and cold metal, a scent that reminded him of the sub-basement hallway. Another door appeared at the far end, wooden, cracked, with a rusted padlock hanging loosely from a latch that looked decades out of date. Jan lifted the key. This time, the metal slid in perfectly. He hesitated for a breath, then turned it. The lock clicked with a soft, hollow sound, as if relieved to finally serve its purpose again after so many silent years. Jan pushed the door open. Inside was a small room, no bigger than a closet, but meticulously organized. Not dusty, not abandoned, maintained. A small lamp sat on a narrow table. Beside it were stacks of film logs, all handwritten. Some pages yellowed, others crisp and new. Jan stepped closer and flipped through the top pages. They weren't studio logs. They were personal logs. Dates ranged from 1972, but each description stopped abruptly on the right margin, as if the writer didn't want to commit the final detail to paper. Jan's chest tightened. Someone had been documenting this room long after Martin supposedly vanished. On the wall hung a pinboard filled with old crew IDs, faces blurred by age, badges cracked and brittle. In the center was a single ID badge, in better condition than the rest. Martin Hale, archive depth. Photo dated 1971. Jan lifted the badge from its pin. The plastic was smooth, not brittle like the others, as if someone had touched it recently. His attention shifted to a metal drawer in the corner. He slid it open. Inside were multiple envelopes, identical to the one Jan had found in the archive room, unlabeled, stacked neatly. He opened the top envelope. Inside was a short strip of film just a few frames long. Each frame showed the same thing, the bent-handled fire door from the footage. But in the last frame, just before the cut, stood a man turning toward the camera. The silhouette was unmistakably Martin. Jan's breath caught. This wasn't footage from 1972. The film quality was newer, maybe late 80s, which meant someone shot this long after Martin's disappearance. Jan looked up at the walls again, at the pinboard, the logs, the carefully arranged envelopes. This room wasn't a storage space. It was a continuation, a place someone returned to repeatedly, a place someone maintained. Behind him, the door hinges creaked softly. Jan turned. The young archival assistant stood in the doorway, her expression calm but unreadable. Too calm, too knowing. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Her eyes moved slowly over the room, lingering on the logs, the envelopes, the badge. "You found it," she whispered. Jan held her gaze. "You knew about this." She didn't deny it. "I didn't know where it was," she said. "Not until you opened the right door." Jan felt the weight of the key in his pocket. "What is this room?" She looked around as if searching for the right words. "It's where the story didn't end," she said softly. "Where someone kept watching." Jan stared at her, reading the subtleties in her face. "Who?" he asked. The assistant stepped closer, her eyes shadowed. "Someone who never stopped documenting," she murmured. "Someone who never really left." The air thickened. Jan realized she wasn't talking about herself. She wasn't talking about a ghost. She was talking about someone whose presence had lingered through years of silence. Small details, quiet touches on forgotten doors. Someone who might have been guiding him from the very beginning. She pointed gently toward the room behind them. "This place," she said, "isn't abandoned." She looked directly at Jan. "It's waiting." Jan walked back toward the main lot. As the last lights dimmed across the old wings, the reel, the key, the notes, all of it felt less like clues and more like gestures from someone who wanted the truth preserved, but only quietly, He paused outside the archive room, the same faint cold drifting from under the door. Nothing moved inside, no voices, no footsteps, only the soft hum of a place holding its breath. Jan slipped the key deeper into his pocket, unsure what door it belonged to, unsure if he even wanted to find it. Some stories didn't end with revelations. Some ended with the understanding that someone, decades earlier, had tried to finish their part. He glanced once more down the empty hallway, clean, still, untouched, and felt a subtle shift. Not fear, not mystery, just the sense of a presence stepping back into silence. The real remained unspoken on the table. The past stayed where it preferred to rest. And Jan walked away, knowing that whatever really happened in 1972 would remain exactly what it had always been. A story sealed behind doors that only open for a moment. A truth that flickers like old film. And a man who left just enough behind to make someone notice. Some endings aren't solved, they're simply left in place.